first start by asking, any one of you know what a high-level climate action champion for COP means? One? Yeah. Great. Fantastic. That was what I was assuming. And in order to explain it and the relevance that role, that logic represents to this group of people, I would like to start with the phrase of Antonio Guterres. You might know him, right? You know the United Nations. I don't have to explain that. Okay, cool. So why Antonio Guterres is now talking about the importance of multi-stakeholder multilateralism? Because as Jita perfectly referred to, we don't exist as non-state actors for the normal negotiation process of the United Nations. The negotiators talk about us as the real world. They live somewhere up there in 30,000 feet high, and they have realized that, oh, when it comes to implementing an agreement, they need the real world. They need the academics. They need the business sector, the financial institutions. And most of the implementation of any agreement happens in subnational governments, municipalities, states. Imagine that the governor of California is a non-state actor governor. It's quite hard for a person like that to be removed from the negotiation. As important is it in the world with its capacity. So in the Paris Agreement was the first time when the governments of the world, in the United Nations lexic, it's called either member states or parties. The parties recognize that when it comes to implementing the agreement, that happens within the non-state actors. And they decided to create an internal agenda in the United Nations for those non-state actors to show if they were capable of doing so. And honestly, with that level of doubt. And the reason of the doubt is because many times they perceive the business sectors and the subnational government as a threat for humanity, as a threat for climate, and they have some reasons for doing so, right? Doesn't mean that all countries behave perfectly. We have been seeing it nowadays in a worst possible way. So in the Paris Agreement, they said, okay, we will start having this agenda inside the United Nations for the non-state actors. It will be called the Climate Action Agenda. So non-state actors related to action and implementation. And they decided that from then on, every country that was taking the presidency of COP will have to name one person to run that agenda. Meaning that person will have the responsibility of mobilizing every single business in the world, every single university in the world, every single financial institution, city, municipality, subnational government in the world. One person. Well, combining 2 by 2. The previous and the following. The first 4, France, Morocco, Fiji, and Poland, were politicians. This was evidently a role designed by politicians and therefore was naturally captured by politicians. When Chile took the presidency of COP25, right after Brazil decided not to, because that was a moment for Latin America, in the last minute they decided, okay, we will do it. We need to name a president for the COP and a high-level champion. And they decided for the first time to innovate and call for someone from the business sector. So I was the first high-level champion being a non-politician. And my role was to innovate inside the United Nations. Normally, innovation and United Nations don't come along very well. And in order to do that, I received one main mandate. Do things in a different way, because this is not progressing. The agenda was set for 5 years, so they gave us the opportunity as non-state actors to show that we were capable only for 5 years, and this wasn't working. The first 4 were failing, and I had just 1 year to do something different, and mainly by following science. Remember that at that time, we had the Paris Agreement with mainly 3 objectives. 1, mitigation. And when it comes to mitigation, it was about the 2 degrees. I don't know how many of you have read the Paris Agreement or were there in the room, but it was reach 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees, or while we do some efforts to reach 1.5 degrees, but the target for many, many, many countries in the world was 2 degrees. If at that time you were questioning the 2 degrees, you were questioning the Paris Agreement. And that was really, really risky. And they were showing that to you. No way to question the 2 degrees as the main trajectory for the warming up of the world. It was in October 2018 when we received the report from the IPCC saying, no. When we compare those two scenarios, 2 degrees and 1.5, there's no way anyone in the world would like to live in a scenario of 2 degrees. We have to go for the 1.5 degrees. That was October 2018. Chile came into the scenario in January 2019. And the second aspect of it was, of course, resilience and adaptation. We have nowadays 4 billion people facing the worst consequences of the climate crisis. And you should all know, mostly people that had zero responsibility on creating this crisis. This year is all about resilience, and not only resilience, it's about loss and damage. Yeah. The language has moved from resilience and adaptation to solidarity to now repair. That's the language of today. So take a look at that, because it's not only about how do we mobilize the technology towards emitting less, we have to embed solidarity in the center. And then the money that is required for doing this. We launched the Race to Zero, the biggest campaign that is putting together all the efforts from the non-state actors towards the 1.5 degrees. We launched the Race to Resilience, and we launched the GFANS, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for NetZero. And let me show to all of you what does it mean, not only in terms of how they are today. Please take one step back and try to see this as a video, not just as a frame of today. That is really important. When it comes to mitigation, when it comes to the Race to Zero, in December 2019, we had the Paris Agreement with the objective of 2 degrees. Of course, the idea was at the time to mobilize the non-state actors. Almost 3 years later, we received the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees. In the mid-2019, the Secretary General said we need to mobilize more action towards this higher ambition. He was concerned that we had just changed the logic of the goals from 2 degrees to 1.5. And in one very beautiful meeting, I was requested, do you think you can bring a kind of 10 companies around the world to commit to a trajectory towards 1.5 degrees, meaning net zero by 2050? And I said, yeah, maybe 20. In September 2019, we had COP25 here in Madrid. You all might know that we had a social unrest in Chile that meant that we had to move all COP from Chile to Madrid in less than 1 month. So this is a COP that had 3 logos. It was first going to be held by Brazil, then Santiago, and then Madrid. I sometimes use the 3 logos to explain what resilience means, or what logistic of a major event means. So in September 2019, we put together approximately 800 companies. In between those 800 companies, just to put a magnifying glass on it, about 500 of them being B Corps with a commitment of net zero by 2030. The SMEs that Gira was referring to, we're mobilizing this, as also, of course, many big multinationals doing the same thing. We went to, that was the summit of the Secretary General in September. Then we went to Madrid with a higher number. In September was about 100 companies. Then in December was about 800 companies. And also, as you see there, not only companies, but cities, regions, investors, and universities. In June 2020, with Nigel Topping, we decided to call this the Race to Zero. We launched it in June 5th, 2020, so 2 years ago. Then in December 2020 was the date when Glasgow was going to be held, but of course, due to COVID, that was postponed to 2021. We update the numbers. In April, we did the same thing. November, we went there. March this year, we are now over 10,000 entities, non-state actors, that in revenue represents more than 20% of the global GDP. If you add also the commitments from countries, you have over 90% of the global GDP committed to a net zero world by in between 2050 and 2060, because, of course, China has it in 2060. What I want you to reflect on is where we were here, or where we were here. It was impossible to dream only 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Secretary General was asking me for 10 companies. That was the reality. That's where we were. And I don't want to sound naive, right? Of course, the world is, can I use bad words? The world is fucked, sure. But we can solve it. We have the technology. We have the capacity, and these commitments are showing that the narrative, the logic that is mobilizing us has shifted in a very short period of time. So I would encourage all of you to take a look at what is happening inside each of those actors. The trajectory is moving to an exponential trajectory, and that happens that, of course, our brain doesn't operate in an exponential way. We tend to see what we're looking today as the gap from where we are to the ideal world. And if we just see the frame, we will focus in the gap as a problem. If we take a look at the trajectory, we will see the gap as an opportunity. That's what I expect that a group like this can provide to the world as the solutions that will embrace that trajectory. What we're confronting also today is that these are amazing commitments. Not all of them are real. There's bullshit there, sure. There's greenwashing there, sure. And we have to clean that up. This year, there are two main trajectories happening. Tomorrow, you might connect to see the process in which we have improved the mechanism of validation of NetZero when it comes to the race to zero, when it comes to the high-level champions work, but also from now to September, we will have the conclusions of the high-level expert group of the Secretary Generals. And we are, of course, trying those two to work together to reach the same conclusions. The other thing that we did is to focus on 2030, because it doesn't, it's nonsense to focus all of our efforts in a 30-year period, while we know by science that the most important trajectory is the one that we have to navigate from now to 2030, including peaking emissions in the next 2 or 3 years. So what we did is we mapped, initially about 70 sectors of the economy, and we have the capability of mapping very precisely about 32 of them, and draw the S-curve, and draw the tipping point, and draw and map everything that was happening in those different sectors to analyze if we have enough actors of that sector of the economy already committing, and if so, meaning 20%, the trajectory is now changing to exponential. And if so, then the technologies are starting to be implemented. Some of them at a pilot stage, some of them at a very secret stage, but many of them being very vocal as well. So we mapped these 32 sectors of the economy, of course, including mass consumption products and consumer goods, and in 18 of them, it should be, did you see the difference? Okay, yeah. Those 18 sectors that are being there bold, thank you, are the ones in which we have seen the trajectory changing, meaning you have more than 20% of the major actors of that sector in the global economy already committed by the Race to Zero to follow science. It's not just committing internally, it's signing a pledge formally to follow science and formally against the United Nations. Second, to validate a plan with science-based targets. Third, to proceed, to start moving ahead. Fourth, to publish, at least once per year. And the fifth P that we're incorporating now is policy, the race to regulation. No company should be fighting this agenda. Every company should start moving from voluntary to regulated. Every company should understand that this is something that we need to work together and to support the governments in the implementation of this agenda. 5 really important actors of this, the financial institutions. Let's go back to the graph. In September 2019, we had the NetZero Asset Owners Alliance being launched with $2.2 trillion committed to follow the trajectory to 1.5 degrees. In December, we kind of doubled that up to $4 trillion in COP25. We were absolutely fascinated. The money was starting to flow, mostly pension funds from the north of Europe, but then in December 2020, we had the inclusion of the asset managers, the NetZero Asset Managers Initiative. They joined with about $7 trillion, so within the 7 trillions and about 5 that we had in the asset owners, we had $13 trillion. We were partying. We couldn't imagine how much money was flowing to really fulfill the trajectory of science. In April 2021, some 24 major banks of the world joined through the NetZero Bank Alliance. In November, we reached $130 trillion committed to follow this. That money is not necessarily today in companies that are necessarily solving the crisis. That money, of course, is committed to move away from fossil fuels. That money is committed to move away first from coal, right? From deforestation. That money is searching for the right type of businesses, of technologies in which to be deployed, at least from here to 2050. It's a long run. It will be a bumpy road, but it's happening. Happening also that, as you have seen in the press, some actors of this alliance have been somehow punished for not being as fast as they should be. Finally, resilience. We will not solve this crisis just by mitigating alone. We will not solve this crisis by just focusing on reducing the emissions and absorbing the carbon from the atmosphere. 4 billion people are now suffering the consequences, mostly women, all of them, or mostly from the global south. As I said, people that had no responsibility whatsoever on creating the crisis. So we created the Race to Resilience to increase the resilience mostly in 3 types of communities. We did a very strong research with McKinsey during 2 years to identify which are those most harmed communities, and those, of course, the coastal communities that are suffering floodings and the increase of the sea level. Rural communities, mostly smallholder farmers that are now being forced to migrate if they don't have the technology, they don't have the capacity of not only surviving the crisis, but also thriving despite of it. And then, of course, the poor people from the cities of the world that live in the conditions that are being absolutely directly affected by the crisis. If we don't fulfill this need, we will fail. There's a marvelous phrase of a woman that is one of my main mentors. It's called Sheila Patel. She says, the poor woman of the world will define if we succeed or not in this agenda. It's not us. It's them. So you might probably all know this graph. This is massive. Of course, this freaks out everyone. We should all be really scared about this graph, but we can do it. Mostly, as we have mapped, we have the technology for the first part. We have to scale it. We have to invest a lot. We have to do much more than we're doing today. But if you take all of the commitments and you take all of the technology, even what has been shown today here, we have the technology to have the emissions in this decade, and therefore we can pave the way to net zero emissions by 2050. But we have to do that with solidarity, and we have to do that with accountability. Those are the 2 main elements that are here in the agenda for this year, and we cannot forget that. Thank you very much.